Now I'm ready to talk about the Voice of Rohan. When Howard Shore composed the soundtrack to go along with Peter Jackson's film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, he didn't just write pretty sounds to go along with the nice images on screen. He very carefully considered the text of the book and transformed it into musical form. He used different themes to speak for the different lands and people of Middle-earth, and in my opinion, the very best theme is the one that speaks for the people of Rohan. When creating different themes for The Lord of the Rings, Howard Shore really considered what kind of music would have existed in the cultures he was representing. For example, the hobbits and the Shire are given a voice with a simple folk melody. In the film soundtrack, the Shire theme is most often played on the fiddle or the tin whistle. These instruments are the best choices to give an authentic voice to English folk music. The fiddle and tin whistle are also things that the hobbits would have been able to make for themselves, given the level of technology they had. But what of the people of Rohan? This is one of the two human kingdoms in The Lord of the Rings. It's a society that Tolkien based mainly on the ancient Anglo-Saxons, although it's easy to also see a little bit of Viking influence. He didn't even bother creating a fictional language for them because he wanted them to be tied to ancient England. So they speak Old English, specifically the dialect from the kingdom of Mercia. The people of Rohan are known for having the finest horses in Middle-earth, and they're very proud of this. Their emblem is a white horse upon a green field, and even the name they use to refer to themselves, Rohirrim, sounds a bit like a horse's whinny. Their capital, Edoras, is a city set on a hilltop above a wide plain. The buildings in Edoras are made of wood, and the people of Rohan have a reasonable level of technology. They're able to craft chainmail, helmets, shields, spears, swords, and, of course, horse tack. They can produce very nice clothing made of linen, wool, leather, and fur, which is then richly decorated with woven and embroidered trim. They're not as sophisticated as the Kingdom of Gondor, or as elegant as the elves. But in their rough, sturdy way, they produce buildings of great beauty. They also engineer enormous burial mounds to honor their dead. The Rohirrim don't know a lot about stonemasonry, though. Even their famous fortress at Helm's Deep was originally built by engineers from Gondor. We get an idea of the sort of clothing and tools that would have been readily available in Rohan in Chapter 3 of Return of the King, when Éowyn takes Meriadoc to get all kitted out for war. Then Éowyn rose up. "Come now, Meriadoc," she said. "I will show you the gear that I have prepared for you." They went out together. "This request only did Aragorn make to me," said Éowyn as they passed among the tents, "that you should be armed for battle. I have granted it as I could, for my heart tells me that you will need such gear ere the end." Now she led Merry to a booth among the lodges of the king's guard, and there an armorer brought out to her a small helm, and a round shield, and other gear. "No mail we have to fit you," said Éowyn, "nor any time for the forging of such a hauberk. But here is a stout jerkin of leather, a belt, and a knife. A sword you have." Merry bowed, and the lady showed him the shield, which was like the shield that had been given to Gimli, and it bore on it the device of the white horse. "Take all these things," she said, "and bear them to good fortune. Farewell now, Master Meriadoc. Yet maybe we shall meet again, you and I." It seemed that there was quite a lot of clothing and weaponry readily available, and that's especially impressive considering that Merry is only half the size of most of the riders of Rohan. So what should the Voice of Rohan sound like in a film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings? Let's see, we've got a nation with a moderate level of technology, and they live in houses made of wood, and they wear clothing made of kind of natural materials, leather, linen. Horses are very important to them. I mean, to me the answer's obvious. There's only one instrument that ties all of that together, and it's a violin. Violins are instruments that can be produced in societies with a moderate level of technology. They're made of wood, and they can't be played without the help of a horse. Every violin bow is made with the same white horsehair that you would see flowing from the helm of Éomer, nephew and heir to the king of Rohan. Howard Shore chose a special type of violin as the voice of the Rohirrim, and that's the Hardanger fiddle. It's the national instrument of Norway. It's played much in the same way as a regular violin, but it has extra strings called sympathetic strings. The bow is pulled across the main strings, but when certain tones are played, the sympathetic strings resonate. This gives the Hardanger fiddle a tone that's deeper and richer and somehow more ancient sounding than an ordinary violin. Whenever I hear it played, it makes me think of echoes in distant mountains, or the beautiful acoustics that you find in an old church. Regular violins were developed in Southern Europe, but the Hardanger fiddle comes from Northern Europe, and the cultures of this region are what Tolkien drew upon when writing about the Rohirrim in The Lord of the Rings. So Howard Shore picked the perfect instrument. But what of the melody itself? How do you describe the Rohirrim in music? Well, here's what Aragorn had to say about them in Chapter 2 of The Two Towers. They are proud and willful, but they are true-hearted, generous in thought and deed, bold but not cruel, wise but unlearned, writing no books but singing many songs, after the manner of the children of men before the dark years. This description calls for a melody that's strong and dignified. It should express a healthy, noble sense of pride rather than joy. I've spoken before about the Shire theme, which is a simple melody written in D major. It perfectly fits alongside any traditional English folk tune. Major keys are mostly associated with happy-sounding music. Composers can use minor keys for a variety of purposes, but it's most common for it to be used to make a song kind of more emotionally colored. Could be sad, could be dignified, could be thoughtful. Now, this isn't always true. If you look in some areas of the world, say Eastern Europe, there's a lot of songs written in minor keys that are absolutely fun to dance to, and they're very happy. But in this case, Howard Shore is kind of taking more of a Western European approach, which is to use a minor key to sort of express a deep, plaintive sadness, and yet still a dignity. It's just the right choice. To give you an idea of how major and minor keys affect songs, here's the Shire theme played normally in D major. And here's what happens to that song if you play it in a minor key. Big difference, right? Howard Shore needed to write the Shire theme in a major key because it needed to sound warm and welcoming. But he needed a really, really different mood to speak for the people of Rohan. This is a very different society from the one we found in Hobbiton. Rohan is a nation of wide, sweeping plains, where people have to work hard to survive, and they have to fight many battles to protect their homes. Life is tougher in Rohan than it is in the Shire, so the people are tougher too. A major key would be too undignified for the Rohirrim, and if you don't believe me, here's what the theme sounds like when it's played properly. And now here's the same tune translated into a major key. I'm sorry in advance if any of you find this offensive. So that's why Howard Shore chose a minor key for the voice of the Rohirrim. But which minor key? Now, I might be reading a little bit too much into things, but it's in the key of E minor, and I love that. If you play the guitar, you'll probably have noticed that there's a lot of songs written for your instrument in E minor, and E minor is kind of the favored key of heavy metal bands. But I think that Howard Shore might possibly have chosen this key because he carefully paid attention to the text of The Lord of the Rings. The Rohan theme is first introduced in The Two Towers. You get a few little hints of it, but it isn't properly introduced until we get that fantastic sweeping shot of the city of Edoras with Éowyn, niece of the king, standing alone to watch the approach of Gandalf, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas. Eomer and Éowyn both start with an E, and the song is written in the key of E minor. Now, that might just be a coincidence, but I also believe that Howard Shore was smart enough to think about the fact that J.R.R. Tolkien was an expert in Anglo-Saxon poetry, and that the people of Rohan are based on the ancient Anglo-Saxons. They did their poetry a little bit differently from what we think of today. Their poetry was what you called alliterative. This means that instead of lines that have kind of the same number of beats and then rhyming words connecting the lines together, you have repeated sounds, most often consonants. So again, modern poetry often relies on vowels in words, things like mouse, house, so that ow sound, and those would arrive at the end of a line if you were writing a poem. But if you look at poems like Beowulf, which J.R.R. Tolkien was famously the master of, that doesn't really rely on that kind of rhyming. Instead, it would repeat a consonant sound and kind of link it through the lines. And the rhythm and the repetition of these sounds is what gives the poem structure rather than, the words that happen at the end. J.R.R. Tolkien focused a huge part of his academic career on this kind of poetry. He crafted his own writing by carefully selecting every sound in every word. So I want to believe that this moment where Éowyn and Éomer are being serenaded in the key of E is something that the professor would have appreciated. I have no way of proving if Howard Shore did this intentionally. I mean, it might just be a really lovely coincidence. But all the same, even if it is, I really, really love that you get this moment of alliteration between the characters, the setting, and the music. Let me know if you agree, if you like this as much as I do, or if you think I need a tinfoil hat. Or I don't know, would a tinfoil helm be more appropriate? All right, so we've got an instrument and a melody, but now we need some rhythm. The people of Rohan are horse lords, and if I asked you to make the sound of a horse galloping, you would probably do something like this. That sound, ba-ba-bum, is built into the melody. It would be a bit cheesy if it was too obvious, so Howard Shore gave it to the fiddle rather than a drum. It would also get obnoxious if it was too constant, so it's broken up with the graceful runs of notes that soar as high as the peaks of the White Mountains. So the thundering sounds of horse hooves are built right into the Rohan theme. We now have our song for the Rohirrim. It's perfectly expressing this culture and its people, but Howard Shore isn't done yet. He's also going to use this song to support the plot of the story. In that triple E scene that I love so much, we're told everything we need to know about what's going on with Rohan. King Théoden is under a terrible spell that allows him to be manipulated by the evil wizard Saruman. The people of Rohan are under attack by roving bands of orcs and wild men. The old alliances hang by a thread. In this stunning scene, we see Éomer alone on a hill. Éowyn stands alone outside the Golden Hall, and the Hardanger fiddle plays, alone. The music here is doing so much at once. It's perfectly representing Éowyn's feelings, the nature of the Rohirrim, the land of Rohan, and what's going on in the plot of the story. This tune is used later in the soundtrack when it's time for the Rohirrim to get down to business. My very favorite use of this theme happens in The Return of the King. It's the moment when the beacons are lit, sending a message to Rohan that the Kingdom of Gondor calls for aid. Now, I know this part of the movie has taken some liberties with the original text of the book. In the book, The Return of the King, the beacons are already lit when Pippin arrives in Gondor. He's not the one who crawls up and lights them without permission. But I would file this under an acceptable condensation of the story. There's just too many characters, and you have to get rid of lots of them to make the movie work. I mean, The Return of the King, the extended edition, is already almost 4 hours long, and more is not always better. I know some of you don't feel that way, but it's true. More isn't always better. So they needed to get rid of some things, and I think by having Pippin light the beacons, it's a bit more exciting. It's a character that we already know doing it, whereas in the text of the book, it happens, out of scene. They just see that the beacons are already lit. We have no idea who lit them. We don't get to see them being lit, which is a beautiful cinematic thing to do. So yes, this bent the story, but I would say it stayed true to the spirit of what Tolkien was writing, which was that Gondor is in dire need and they're calling out to their last known ally. We just got it in a way for the film that's just a bit more cinematic and exciting. It also gives us one of the most stirring musical moments in the entire film trilogy. I love it. But what's going on with the music here? This is one of the most literal uses of themes in the entire film trilogy. It starts with the strings playing a flickering set of arpeggios. If you look at the sheet music, the notes bob up and down like the small flame of a candle. The beacons have just been lit. They're small, but they're growing. You then get the Gondor theme. Gondor is voiced by brass instruments. It takes a pretty high level of technology in order to manufacture things like trombones, trumpets, and French horns. They have slides, valves, and delicate moving parts. They start out as thin sheets of highly polished brass, and they require precise skill to play. The people of Gondor are the most enlightened and technologically advanced of all mortal races in Middle-earth, which is why Howard Shore used brass instruments to represent them. And as the beacons are lit one by one, the Gondor theme calls out. This will sound a little cheesy, but I'm going to put lyrics to it. Gondor calls for aid. Like the theme is literally calling out. Like I said, it sounds cheesy if you put actual words to it, but that's often why instrumental music is a little bit better for storytelling than vocals. The message flickers across the tops of the White Mountains. As it finally arrives in Rohan, the notes ascend, the same way a voice does when asking a question. Once again, you could put lyrics to it. Will you come? It goes up the same way a voice does. Aragorn runs to King Théoden and delivers the message.
Gondor calls for aid!
And in this moment, every man, woman, wizard, elf, dwarf, and hobbit holds their breath. And so does the soundtrack. Théoden gives his answer. And then we hear the Gondor theme, but it's no longer played on a lonely Hardanger fiddle. Instead, it's played proud, willful, true-hearted, generous, and bold on a horn as a rousing call to arms.
And Rohan will answer. Muster the Rohirrim!
Yeah, where's my spear? Let's go kill some orcs! Sorry, don't know what came over me. Gondor called for aid, and Rohan answered. A lesser composer would have had way too big of an ego to leave 11 seconds of silence in the soundtrack. No, instead, a composer who wasn't as good as Howard Shore would have done some annoying thing like have this high string sound filling the gap, and it would have completely ruined the moment. No, Howard Shore was smart enough to know when to be quiet. Music composition isn't just about the notes in the song. It's also about the space that's left around those notes. Now, I did notice that the key changed in this scene. When the Rohan theme was partly revealed at the beginning of the film, and when it's fully unveiled later on, it's played in that key of E minor. But in this later scene, it jumps down nearly an octave and is played in F minor. This is most likely because it's switching from a string instrument to a brass instrument, but with apologies to brass players, I'm not going to get into how wind instruments produce sound because that's outside my current topic. What I want to talk about is the way this new lower sound supports the plot and the characters in the scene. I might be needing my tinfoil helm again, because as with that alliteration scene, I don't have proof that Howard Shore did this intentionally, but I still really like it. That first full introduction of the Rohan theme is played on a fiddle, which is an instrument that has roughly the same range as women's voices. So it's quite fitting to have the fiddle playing while the scene focuses on Éowyn. But now, when the tune is used as a call to war, the instrument switches to a horn and drops down. This makes perfect sense. Horns have been used for thousands of years to call out to warriors on the battlefield, and the men of Rohan are now springing to action. As Éomer points out,
War is the province of men, Éowyn.
And while, of course, women are sometimes involved in the military, in history, in fiction, and still in the modern day, war is primarily conducted by men. So it makes sense that the Rohan theme has now dropped down to a range that men could sing. However, as we all know, our favorite shield maiden Éowyn will be playing a pretty important part in the battle to come. We get a nice little foreshadowing of that in this tiny moment between Éowyn and her brother Éomer. They say nothing, but they share a glance deep with meaning. Éomer knows he must go to war, again. And he knows Éowyn wants to come along. But he doesn't want her to. He loves his sister and is destroyed when he later finds her wounded on the battlefield. In the film, Éomer actively discourages Éowyn from her romantic notions of glory on the battlefield. This is a consolidation of a few moments in the book where Éowyn's discouraged from going to war by other characters. The way I read it, experienced warriors know what battle is really like, and they can see that Éowyn's desire for glory is going to slam right up against the brutal realities of fighting. Éomer can't bear the idea of harm coming to his sister. Karl Urban's acting in the scenes after the battle are really moving, and they show that Éomer has a tender heart underneath that tough exterior. He has no romantic illusions about war, but he will fight those wars to protect his land, his people, and his family. That doesn't make the price of those wars any less terrible to pay. This tiny little moment foreshadows what's to come. Éomer looks at his sister to say, "I'm going to war, and you're not. I don't want you to get hurt." Éowyn looks back at her brother and just as firmly signals that she doesn't care if she gets hurt. She wants to choose her own fate. And it's a good thing she does because Éowyn, along with the hobbit Merry, takes down the most dangerous foe on the battlefield, who cannot be killed by a man. So when Howard Shore has the Rohan theme call out in this moment, he dropped the key down into a male vocal range, but he put it in the upper part of the male vocal range, which overlaps with the lower end of the female vocal range. The call to arms is made mainly to men, but a woman can still find her way in. This might just be another really lovely coincidence, but I love the way it supports both the plot and the characters in this scene. I believe Howard Shore was smart enough to think about this, so I choose to believe that this was a brilliant act of musical storytelling on his part. I hope that you enjoyed this exploration of the way that Howard Shore gave a voice to the people of Rohan in the Lord of the Rings film trilogy. The Rohan theme can be used quietly to express deeply held emotions, and it can be shouted out like a war cry. It comes up many times in the soundtrack. I'd be interested to know which use of it's your favorite, so do let me know. As you can probably tell, the Rohan theme is my absolute favorite in the film trilogy directed by Peter Jackson. Nothing else even comes close. It's a tune that's brought to life with the very wood and horsehair that surrounded the Rohirrim. It's proud and strong as it gallops along to glory. It's truly worthy of the people of Rohan and the master storyteller who created them.